I would never forgive her, people say, when I tell them what Brenda did. I would never speak to her again. I would never let her into my life. I didn't forgive Brenda. I didn't speak to her again. And I definitely didn't let her into my life. But I also did something else. I called the police. Yes, you read that right. I called the police on my stepmother for throwing away my mother's ashes. And I had her arrested. Fingerprinted. Mugshot taken. The works. Why? Because she deserved it. Because what she did wasn't just disrespectful, it was illegal. Under State Penal Code 442B, the intentional and improper disposal of human remains is a felony. And Brenda, in her infinite wisdom, had committed that felony in the most spectacularly stupid way possible. This isn't a story about forgiveness. This is a story about justice. It's about what happens when you push a grieving daughter too far. It's about the moment when love meets handcuffs, and Swedish death cleaning meets a compost heap. The day my father remarried, I knew my life as I knew it was over. Not because I was a bitter daughter clinging to the past like a shipwreck survivor to driftwood, though I'm sure Brenda would have described me that way, but because the woman my father had chosen to spend the rest of his life with was a walking, talking, velvet tracksuited catastrophe named Brenda. Brenda was a force of nature, the kind of woman who used love as a personal mantra and believed that essential oils could cure everything from cancer to a broken heart. She had a penchant for chunky jewelry that looked like it had been stolen from a medieval bishop's estate sale, a laugh that sounded like a goose being strangled by an overly enthusiastic puppeteer, and a terrifyingly unwavering belief that she was the protagonist in a movie about her own life. My father, a mild-mannered accountant who had been lost at sea since my mother's passing, was completely and utterly enchanted by this hurricane in a leopard print kaftan. And I, Maya Henderson, was the inconvenient supporting character who was apparently ruining the vibe. Let me paint you a picture of my mother, Sarah. She was everything Brenda was not. Elegant, understated, with a quiet wit that could slice through pretension like a hot knife through butter. She collected vintage teacups and had a laugh that sounded like wind chimes. She smelled of rosewater and freshly baked bread. She was the heart of our home, the gentle current that kept our little family boat steady. When she died, cancer, mercifully quick at the end, my father and I were devastated. We clung to each other like two survivors of a shipwreck, adrift in a sea of grief. For 2 years, we managed. The house remained a museum of her memory, her knitting basket still by the armchair, her gardening gloves still hanging by the back door, her small wooden urn containing her ashes resting on the mantelpiece like a quiet guardian. Then Dad met Brenda at a singles over 60 speed dating event that his well-meaning but meddlesome sister, Aunt Patricia, had dragged him to. I still remember the phone call. "Maya, sweetheart," he'd said, his voice tinged with a nervous excitement I hadn't heard in years. "I've met someone. Her name is Brenda. She's so full of life." I should have known then. Full of life was the diplomatic way of saying overwhelmingly, aggressively, exhaustingly alive. The wedding was a blur of peach-colored decorations, a harpist who played Wind Beneath My Wings 3 times, and Brenda's insistence on releasing doves that promptly pooped on the wedding cake. I smiled through it all, a rictus grin of forced acceptance. Dad deserved happiness, I told myself. If Brenda made him happy, I would be supportive. I had no idea that Brenda's version of happiness involved erasing every trace of my mother's existence from the face of the earth. It was a crisp October afternoon, 3 weeks after the wedding. My apartment felt sterile and quiet, the silence oppressive in a way it never had before. I missed the comfortable chaos of my childhood home, the way my mother's presence seemed to fill every corner with warmth. I decided to visit Dad and his new bride, to try, one more time, to find some common ground with the woman who had replaced my mother. I let myself in with the old key, the one Mom and I had always used. It was a small act of defiance that I knew would grate on Brenda's nerves, but I didn't care. The house I grew up in was still mine in some fundamental way. The moment I stepped through the door, I felt it. The house had been Brendified. Everything was beige. Not a warm, inviting beige, but a cold, soulless beige that seemed to suck the life out of the room. The walls, once a cheerful butter yellow, were now a shade that could only be described as mushroom. The mismatched cushions my mother had collected over decades of yard sales and craft fairs had been replaced by brutally geometric throw pillows that looked like they would cut you if you sat on them wrong. The air smelled of artificial vanilla, cloying and chemical, masking something older and more authentic. "Maya, darling." Brenda's voice trilled from the kitchen, the goose-strangling laugh echoing off the new granite countertops. "We're in the living room. I've just finished a little redecoration. It's what we call a Swedish death cleaning vibe. So refreshing." Swedish death cleaning. The irony was so thick I could have cut it with one of those geometric throw pillows. I walked into the living room, and my heart sank further. My father was perched on a new, brutally angular sofa that looked like it had been designed by someone who hated comfort. He was wearing a cable-knit sweater that was entirely the wrong color for his complexion, a sickly beige that matched the walls. His expression was a familiar one, the pained, desperate look of a man trying to pass off profound discomfort as contentment. "Sweetheart, good to see you," he said, his voice a little too bright, a little too strained. I gave him a hug, the fabric of his new sweater feeling as foreign as everything else in the room. His body was tense, and I could feel him holding his breath, waiting for something. Probably waiting for me to comment on the decor. I didn't. I was a master of strategic silence. That's when I noticed it. The mantelpiece, which had always held a small, unassuming wooden urn containing my mother's ashes, was now an empty, glossy expanse. The urn that had been there for 2 years, a constant quiet presence, was gone. In its place was a garish glass vase filled with what looked like dried twigs and dusty cotton balls. My heart did a strange, stuttering thing in my chest, like a bird trapped in a cage. "Dad," I said, my voice unnervingly calm. "Where is it?" He went pale. I mean, truly, spectacularly pale, the color of skim milk. He shot a panicked look at Brenda, his eyes wide with something that looked like fear. "Where is what, sweetie?" Brenda chirped, bustling in with a tray of what looked like chia seed puddings topped with edible flowers. She was wearing another kaftan, this one a violent shade of purple that clashed magnificently with the beige walls. Her hair was wrapped in a silk turban the color of a bruised plum. "Oh, that little box?" I had to move it. It was such a downer, you know? Completely clashed with the new pale almond color scheme. So drab. I put it in the guest room closet, but then I was doing a deep clean. I use a wonderful lavender and tea tree oil blend, so detoxifying, and it got in the way. So I just decluttered it. The words hit me like a physical blow. "Decluttered it," I repeated, my voice hollow. "It was just a bit of dust, really," she said, waving a dismissive hand that sparkled with at least 3 chunky rings. "I took it to the community compost heap. Very environmentally friendly. It's the circle of life, darling. That's the real beauty of it." My vision went red. A red so pure and fierce it was almost spiritual. The kind of red you see in old paintings of martyrs, the red of blood and sacrifice and righteous fury. A scream of pure rage and grief was building in my throat, a primal sound that would have made a banshee proud. But I am not a screamer. I am a problem solver. A strategist. A woman who knows that the best revenge is served cold, with a side of legal documentation. A small, chilling smile touched my lips. The community compost heap, I echoed. Yes, she beamed, clearly mistaking my shock for admiration. For the new herb garden. I'm growing rosemary. It's wonderful for memory, you know. Rosemary for memory, I said, the smile growing wider, more brittle. How perfectly poetic. My father looked like he was going to be sick. The color that had drained from his face was now making a reappearance in the form of a sickly green tinge. Maya, I'm so sorry, she didn't realize. Oh, I'm sure she didn't, I cut him off, my eyes locked on Brenda's smug, self-satisfied face. It's fine. Accidents happen. Just a little misunderstanding, right? I was a model of grace. I smiled. I accepted a chia pudding I had no intention of eating, and I made pleasant small talk for 20 more agonizing minutes. I complimented the new pale almond paint. I asked about the dried twigs in the vase. I even let Brenda show me her new essential oil diffuser, which she claimed would balance the chakras of the entire house. I was a consummate actress, a master of the social performance. Because while Brenda thought she was dealing with a heartbroken, powerless young woman, I was already mentally filing a police report. I was already calculating the exact charges that would apply. I was already imagining the look on her face when the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. The next morning, I was up before dawn. I had done my research. The state penal code was clear. The intentional and improper disposal of human remains was a felony. A Class C felony, to be precise, punishable by up to 10 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. But first, I needed evidence. The Sunnydale community compost heap was exactly as glamorous as it sounded, a fenced-off area on the edge of town, a mecca of rotting vegetable peels, grass clippings, and despair. The smell hit me before I even got out of the car, an aggressive, earthy stench that was equal parts decay and fecundity. It was the smell of things ending and beginning, of rot and rebirth. If I'd been in a more philosophical mood, I might have found it profound. As it was, I just found it revolting. I found the only person there, a man who looked like he was having a passionate affair with a large fork. He was wearing overalls and a flannel shirt despite the mild weather, and he had the weathered, patient look of someone who had spent too much time around decomposing matter. "Excuse me," I said, approaching him with my most winning smile. "I'm looking for something that might have been dropped off here a few days ago." "A wooden box?" He scratched his head, leaving a smear of dirt in his graying hair. "You mean the one with the pretty box?" "Yeah, some lady in a fancy car drove right up and dumped a whole load." Sad-looking box. My heart sank, but I pressed on. "Do you remember where she put it?" "Exactly?" He pointed to a section of the heap that looked particularly busy. "Over there." "But it's been a few days." "That's a high-traffic area. Lots of new deposits." I thanked him and walked over to the area he'd indicated. The ground was littered with the detritus of suburban life, coffee grounds, banana peels, eggshells, and other less identifiable organic matter. I knelt down, ignoring the protest of my designer jeans, and began to dig. For an hour, I searched. My hands were covered in dirt, my knees were aching, and I was fighting back tears. It was gone. Mixed in with carrot peelings and used coffee grounds. My mother, who had always been so elegant and put together, was now, on a cellular level, part of a massive pile of rotting organic matter. It was the most Brenda thing that had ever happened. But then my fingers brushed against something solid. Something that wasn't a rock or a piece of broken pottery. I dug deeper, my heart pounding, and pulled out a small piece of wood. It was a fragment of the urn. The wood was warped and stained, but there was no mistaking it. I had helped pick out that urn with my father. I had run my fingers over its smooth surface countless times. This was it. I didn't find the ashes themselves. That would have been too much to hope for. But I had evidence. I had proof that Brenda had taken the urn, and the remains it contained, and dumped them in a municipal compost heap. I carefully wrapped the piece of wood in a handkerchief and placed it in my bag. I also scooped up a small container of the soil from the exact spot where I'd found it. It might be useful. It might be nothing. But I was going to be thorough. The Sunnydale Police Department was a building that smelled faintly of stale coffee and printer toner, with the kind of fluorescent lighting that made everyone look like they were auditioning for a zombie movie. I approached the front desk, where a bored-looking officer was filing his nails. "I'd like to report a crime," I said, my voice steady. He looked up, his eyes flickering over my disheveled appearance. I must have looked like I'd been crawling through a compost heap, which, to be fair, I had. "What kind of crime?" "A desecration of human remains." His eyebrows shot up. He put down the nail file. "Come again?" "My stepmother," I said, my voice trembling with a carefully constructed mixture of grief and outrage, "threw away my late mother's ashes. Took the urn to a compost heap. Mixed her with garbage." Officer Miller, I'd read his nameplate, leaned back in his creaky chair, his face cycling through a series of emotions. Shock. Pity. Professional resolve. That's a very serious charge, miss. Desecration is a felony in this state." "Are you absolutely sure?" "I'm sure," I said, and the tears I'd been holding back all morning finally spilled over. They weren't entirely fake. The grief was real, the anger was real, the sense of violation was real. The tears were just, strategically deployed. She proudly told me. Said it clashed with her decor. He took notes, his face a mask of horrified sympathy. He had the soft hands of a man who appreciated a good cup of tea and felt deeply, personally affronted by bad manners. "And your father?" "He was there. He heard everything. He didn't stop her." Officer Miller's expression hardened. That's a terrible thing, miss. Absolutely terrible. We'll need to take a full statement. We'll need to interview your stepmother. We'll need to go to the compost heap." The wheels of justice, once properly greased by a grief-stricken, vengeance-driven daughter, began to grind into motion. The next few days were a masterpiece of bureaucratic warfare. I had to provide a detailed written statement, which I did with the thoroughness of a novelist. I described the urn, its placement on the mantelpiece, the moment I noticed it was gone. I quoted Brenda verbatim, "It was just a bit of dust, it was such a downer, I took it to the community compost heap." I left nothing out. A forensics team, much to their confusion, had to visit the compost heap. I watched from my car as they poked and prodded at the pile of organic matter, their hazmat suits looking absurdly out of place among the coffee grounds and banana peels. They recovered the rest of the urn, what was left of it, anyway. They took soil samples. They even found a few bone fragments, which had probably been part of the cremains. The forensic specialist, a young woman with kind eyes, assured me they would do their best to recover what they could. I didn't tell her that the bone fragments were from my mother's left femur. I didn't need to. She knew. The real drama came when Officer Miller had to interview Brenda. It took him 2 days to find a time when she was available. Brenda, apparently, was very busy with her new hobby of influencing on social media. She'd started a TikTok account called Brenda's Blissful Life, where she gave advice on decluttering, essential oils, and finding your inner goddess. She had 12 followers, most of whom appeared to be bots. I was there for the interview. Naturally. I wasn't going to miss this for the world. Brenda answered the door in a leopard print kaftan, her hair wrapped in a silk turban the color of a violent sunset. When she saw Officer Miller, her smile faltered for just a moment before snapping back into place. "Officer, what a pleasant surprise," she chirped, her voice a full octave higher than usual. "Is this about the neighborhood watch? I've been saying we need more patrolling. These teenagers are a menace. Just last week, I saw one of them with a skateboard." "A skateboard? In this neighborhood?" Officer Miller, his face a mask of awkward professionalism, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm afraid I'm here to ask you some questions regarding the disposal of a cremation urn and the remains it contained." Brenda's jaw dropped. A little puff of air escaped her, the sound of a balloon deflating. Oh, that little box? It was just old dust. I was doing the Fly Lady cleaning routine. You have to let go of the old to make room for the new. That's what Fly Lady says. You can't organize clutter. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "we have a witness statement from Ms. Maya Henderson, and we have recovered the damaged urn. Did you or did you not remove the urn from the house and transport it to the municipal compost facility?" She looked at my father, who was standing in the doorway behind her, his face the color of old milk. "Tell him, Gary. It was a mistake. It was an accident. I didn't know what was in it." "Brenda, I told you to leave it alone," my father whined, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "I told you it was important. I told you it was your mother's, it was a downer, Gary. The whole house was a monument to her. It was creepy. I couldn't relax. I couldn't breathe. It was like she was still there, watching me." "Mrs. Henderson," Officer Miller cut in, his voice now as stern as a disappointed headmaster, "under State Penal Code 442B, the intentional and improper disposal of human remains is a felony. I'm going to have to ask you to come down to the station." And then it happened. The thing I will treasure in my heart forever. Brenda fainted dead away. It wasn't a graceful, ladylike swoon. It wasn't the kind of faint you see in old movies, where the heroine falls delicately onto a chaise lounge. This was a full-on, eyes rolling back, knees buckling, kaftan billowing collapse right onto the new beige rug. She went down like a sack of potatoes. There was a thud that I could feel through the floorboards. Her turban came loose and rolled under the coffee table. One of her chunky rings flew off and skittered across the floor. My father made a pathetic, squeaking noise and rushed to her side, fanning her face with his hands. "Brenda! Brenda, wake up! Don't die. I just bought new curtains." I just stood there, a beatific smile on my face. It was a perfect, glorious moment of cosmic justice. It was the universe, finally, on my side. It was every petty grievance I'd ever had with Brenda, every passive-aggressive comment, every eye roll at my mother's memory, all culminating in this one perfect, beautiful moment. Officer Miller, to his credit, maintained his professional composure. He called for an ambulance, But he also made sure Brenda was properly arrested once she regained consciousness. He wasn't going to let a little fainting spell derail the machinery of justice. They took her to the hospital first, where she was treated for emotional distress and given a sedative. Then they took her to the station, where she was processed, fingerprinted, and had her mugshot taken. The mugshot was a masterpiece of despair. Her perfectly arranged hair was a mess, her mascara was streaked down her cheeks like the tracks of a tiny weeping clown. She was wearing a jail-issued jumpsuit that was, mercifully, not pale almond. She looked like a startled, and deeply unhappy, poodle. I may or may not have framed that mugshot and hung it in my apartment. I'll never tell. I became an overnight internet celebrity, the poster child for the burn it all down approach to family drama. It was, in a word, delightful. The legal proceedings began in earnest. Brenda was released on bail, my father had to mortgage the house to pay it, and she was ordered to appear in court. The prosecutor, a man named District Attorney Harrington, who had the look of someone who had been waiting his whole career for a case exactly like this, was having the time of his life. "Your Honor," he said in opening statements, "the defendant engaged in a premeditated act of desecration. She knowingly, willfully, and with malice aforethought disposed of human remains in a municipal compost heap. She showed no remorse. She showed no understanding of the gravity of her actions. She treated a human being's remains like yesterday's garbage." I was in the courtroom, of course. Front row. I was wearing my mother's favorite dress, a simple navy blue number with a white collar. It smelled faintly of her rosewater perfume, and I'd been carrying it around in a plastic bag for 3 years, waiting for the right moment to wear it again. This was the right moment. Brenda was sitting at the defense table, looking small and diminished. She'd had to buy a new outfit for the occasion, a sensible, boring gray suit that made her look like a retired secretary. Her hair was subdued, her jewelry minimal. It was a transformation so complete it was almost admirable. But I knew what lurked beneath the surface. I knew the caftans were still there, lurking in her closet, waiting for the day when this was all over. The defense attorney, a man named Mr. Henderson, no relation, but the coincidence delighted me, argued that Brenda had made an honest mistake. "My client is a woman of a certain age," he said, "who was doing her best to integrate into a new family. She simply didn't understand the significance of the items she disposed of. It was an error in judgment, not a crime." "An error in judgment?" the prosecutor shot back. "Your client admitted to knowing that the urn contained human remains. She admitted to thinking they were just dust. She admitted to wanting to declutter them. This is not a mistake. This is intentional disregard for the sanctity of human remains." The judge, a stern woman named Judge Patricia O'Malley, looked like she'd seen it all. She had the kind of face that said, "I've been on the bench for 30 years and nothing surprises me anymore." But even she seemed taken aback by the details of this case. "Mrs. Henderson," she said, fixing Brenda with a gimlet eye, "is it true that you referred to the ashes of your husband's late wife as just dust?" Brenda squirmed in her chair. It's just that, they looked like dust. And I was trying to clean." "And the book said, the book?" Judge O'Malley interrupted. "What book?" "Swedish death cleaning," Brenda mumbled. "It's a book about clearing out the clutter before you die. It's very popular. All the influencers are doing it." "So you were planning to die?" Judge O'Malley asked, her eyebrow arching so high it almost reached her hairline. "No. I mean, eventually, yes, or were you planning someone else's death? Perhaps your stepdaughter's?" The courtroom erupted in gasps. Brenda looked like she was going to faint again. I bit my lip to keep from laughing. After a week of legal maneuvering, the prosecutor offered Brenda a plea deal. I was consulted, of course. I was the victim, the wronged party, the woman whose mother's ashes had been defiled by a leopard print kaftan-wearing menace. I think she deserves to spend at least some time in prison, I said to the prosecutor. But I also think public humiliation is more effective than incarceration. Interesting, he said, stroking his chin. What did you have in mind? The court should mandate that her community service be done at the municipal compost heap, where she dumped my mother's ashes. She should have to work there, with her own hands, turning the compost. I want her to spend every day for the next year breathing in the smell of rotting vegetables and thinking about what she did. The prosecutor smiled. It was a cold, professional smile, but there was a glint in his eye that said he appreciated my creativity. I think that's workable. I'll see what I can do. The plea deal was accepted. Brenda pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of unlawful disposal of remains, a misdemeanor. She had to pay a substantial fine to a charity for bereavement support. I'd picked one that worked with bereaved families, and she had to complete 300 hours of community service. At the compost heap. The judge, clearly amused by the creative sentencing, also added a few extra conditions. Brenda had to provide a formal written apology to me, which she did under duress. She had to attend counseling for boundary issues. And she was forbidden from entering my mother's house, the house she'd tried to Brenda for the next 5 years. My father, finally realizing the magnitude of what he'd done by enabling Brenda, offered to have the house redecorated. Whatever you want, Maya, he said, his voice thick with shame. Whatever colors. Whatever furniture. It's your house. It was always your house. I thought about it. I thought about restoring it to the way it had been when my mother was alive. The butter-yellow walls, the mismatched cushions, the old worn couch that had been so comfortable. But then I realized something. That house was never going to be the same. My mother was gone. Brenda had seen to that, in more ways than one. The memories were still there, but the physical space had been violated. It was like an old photograph that had been ripped and taped back together. You could still see the image, but the cracks were always there. Keep it, I said to my father. Keep it however you want. Just, no more beige. And no more Swedish death cleaning. He promised. I didn't believe him entirely, but I appreciated the gesture. The court mandated that Brenda's community service be done at the municipal compost heap. I'm not ashamed to say I laughed like a hyena when I read that stipulation. It was so perfectly poetic, so beautifully karmic. The woman who had mixed my mother's ashes with carrot peelings and coffee grounds was now going to spend her days turning compost, her hands covered in the very dirt she'd sought to declutter. I visited her on her first day. I couldn't resist. She was wearing a pair of faded overalls and thick rubber boots, a far cry from her leopard print kaftans. She was wielding a pitchfork with the enthusiasm of a condemned woman, turning a massive pile of decomposing grass clippings. Her hair, usually so perfectly coiffed, was escaping from a lopsided ponytail. There was a smear of what looked like coffee grounds on her cheek. She looked miserable. Having fun? I called out, my voice cheerful. She glared at me, her eyes full of a fury that was all the more potent for being impotent. What do you want? Just checking in. You know, making sure the community service is going well. Wouldn't want you to have any violations. The prosecutor said I wasn't supposed to have contact with you, she snapped. I'm not here for contact, I said, my voice even. I'm just here to observe. She went back to her work, stabbing the pitchfork into the pile with unnecessary violence. I watched her for a few minutes, enjoying the sight of her suffering. But then something strange happened. The compost heap smelled. It was the same aggressive, earthy stench I remembered from my first visit. But this time it didn't repulse me. Maybe I was getting used to it. Maybe I was starting to see it differently. I thought about my mother. I thought about how she'd loved gardening, how she'd spend hours in her small backyard plot, nurturing her roses and her herbs. I thought about how she'd always said that death was just another part of the cycle, that the things we love never really leave us. "Excuse me," I said to Frank, the man in overalls. "Is there any way I could get some of the soil from the heap?" He looked at me like I'd just asked him to dance. "You want compost?" "From that section," I said, pointing to the area where I'd found the urn fragments. The older section." He shrugged. "Sure, take what you want. It's free." I had come prepared. I went back to my car and retrieved a large plastic container and a garden trowel. I walked to the section of the heap I'd indicated and knelt down, ignoring the protests of my knees. The smell was strong, but I didn't mind. I took the trowel and carefully began to scoop the beautiful, dark soil into my container. It was rich and loamy, the kind of soil that gardeners would pay a fortune for. It was completely organic, utterly natural, and a perfect monument to the very act that had been meant to ruin me. Brenda watched me, her confusion giving way to a dawning, horrified understanding. "What are you doing?" she whispered. "I'm taking my mother home," I said, my voice steady. And I was. Not her ashes, because those were gone. But the soil that had absorbed her, the soil that had become part of her. It was the closest thing to a burial plot I could give her. I filled the container, patted the soil down, and stood up. I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked back to my car, not once looking back at Brenda. I felt her eyes on me, but I didn't care. I had what I came for. That evening, my father and I, finally united in purpose, prepared the soil in the backyard. We used the rich, dark compost as a base, mixing it with potting soil in a beautiful, heavy ceramic planter we'd bought together. "We should plant something," my father said, his voice thick with emotion. "Something she loved." I nodded. "Rosemary." "Rosemary?" "For remembrance," I said. "It's what Brenda was going to plant in her herb garden. But I think it's more fitting for us." He smiled, a genuine smile, the first I'd seen from him in weeks. "She would have loved that. She always said rosemary was the best herb for cooking." We went to the garden center the next day. It was a place of happy memories for us, my mother had loved it. She'd drag us there every spring, her eyes lighting up at the sight of the new seedlings and the displays of colorful flowers. She'd spend hours selecting just the right plants, consulting with the staff about soil conditions and sun exposure. I picked out a small, sturdy rosemary bush, its leaves releasing a fragrant, piney scent when I brushed against them. My father bought a set of gardening gloves, the kind my mother had always worn, with the little rubber bumps on the palms for grip. "You should have these," he said, pressing them into my hands. "She would have wanted you to have them." We planted the rosemary bush in the ceramic planter. We used the compost soil as a base, mixing it with the potting soil. It felt symbolic, in a way I couldn't quite articulate, my mother's remains, now part of the soil that would nourish the plant that would remember her. "I'm sorry, Maya," my father said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything. For letting Brenda. I should have stopped her. I should have protected your mother's memory. I looked at him. He looked older, but also more himself. The spell Brenda had cast over him was finally broken. He was no longer in the thrall of her essential oils and enthusiastic personality. He saw her for the chaotic, boundary-annihilating force of nature she was. "It's okay, Dad," I said, and I meant it. "We're both learning. We're both healing." We stood there in the twilight, looking at the small, new plant. The rosemary bush, growing in soil that had once been my mother, and a compost heap that was now the symbol of our family's healing. I don't know if it was the specific composition of the soil, the excellent drainage, or the ghost of my mother finally at peace, but that rosemary bush grew like nothing I'd ever seen. It was vigorous, almost alarmingly so. Within 2 weeks, it had tripled in size. Within a month, it was a sprawling, fragrant monster of a plant. It was the healthiest, happiest, most ridiculously robust rosemary bush in the history of botany. I was half convinced it was going to start speaking to me. My mother, it turned out, was a surprisingly effective fertilizer. I started using the rosemary in my cooking. I made rosemary chicken, rosemary potatoes, rosemary bread. I even made rosemary-infused olive oil, which I gave to friends and family as gifts. "It's from my mother," I'd say, and they'd nod knowingly, understanding the significance. The bush became a kind of shrine. I'd sit by it in the evenings, talking to my mother about my day, about my life, about the things I wished I could have told her. I know it sounds crazy. I know it sounds like the kind of thing a grieving person does when they can't let go. But it helped. It helped in a way that nothing else had. My father started visiting too. He'd bring a chair and a glass of wine, and we'd sit together, sharing stories about my mother. The time she'd tried to bake a cake and set the kitchen on fire. The time she'd chased a raccoon out of the garden with a broom. The time she'd laughed so hard at a joke that she'd snorted, which made her laugh even harder. "She was something, wasn't she?" my father said one evening, his eyes misty. "She was everything," I agreed. The rosemary bush seemed to listen. It would rustle in the breeze, its leaves releasing that familiar, comforting scent. It was like my mother was still there, watching over us, reminding us that life goes on. Meanwhile, Brenda was still serving her community service at the compost heap. I'd get updates from Frank, who found the whole situation endlessly amusing. "She's getting better," he told me one day. "She stopped crying when she picks up the pitchfork. I think she's starting to accept her fate." "Acceptance is the first step toward redemption," I said, quoting a self-help book I'd been reading. "Or the first step toward complete mental breakdown," Frank said, shrugging. "Hard to tell with that one." I laughed. It felt good to laugh. It felt good to be on the other side of this whole ordeal, to have survived the beige apocalypse and come out stronger. But I wasn't done yet. I had one more score to settle. Brenda had started a new venture in the wake of her legal troubles. I'd heard about it through the grapevine. One of my father's friends had mentioned it, his voice dripping with disdain. "She's writing a book," he'd said. "A self-help book. About finding peace through chaos or some such nonsense." I couldn't believe it. The woman who had meticulously planned and executed a Swedish death cleaning and had a full-on meltdown about a color scheme was now preaching the virtues of chaos and flow. I had to see it for myself. I found out she was doing a book reading at a local bookstore, a small, independent place that had probably been talked into hosting her by someone who didn't know the full story. The event was called Brenda's Book of Serenity, Finding Peace in a Chaotic World. I almost choked on my coffee when I saw the flyer. I decided to attend. Not to make a scene, exactly. Just to observe. To see what version of events she was peddling to the unsuspecting public. The bookstore was packed, well, packed for a small independent bookstore, which meant about 20 people, mostly elderly women who looked like they were in desperate need of some entertainment. I slipped in at the back, wearing a hat and sunglasses, trying to blend in. Brenda was on a small stage at the front, wearing a surprisingly tasteful cream-colored dress. She had a microphone and a book in her hands, her book, with her face on the cover, looking serene and wise and nothing like the woman I'd seen fainting on a beige rug. "And that is the story of how I chose grace over vengeance," she was saying, her voice dripping with faux sincerity. It was a powerful lesson in forgiveness and letting go. The universe tested me, and I emerged a better person. I learned that sometimes we have to be stripped of everything to see what truly matters. I couldn't help myself. I walked to the back of the small crowd, my arms crossed over my chest. I wanted to see how this was going to play out. "So, you're all just embracing the chaos?" an audience member asked. "Yes, darling," Brenda said, waving her hands. "It's all about flow. You have to go with the flow. That's the secret to serenity. Just let the universe guide you." It was the greatest work of fiction I had ever witnessed. The woman who had meticulously planned and executed a Swedish death cleaning and had a full-on meltdown about a color scheme was now preaching the virtues of chaos and flow. I had to say something. I wasn't going to out her publicly, not here. But I wanted her to know I was here. I raised my hand, a curious expression on my face. "Yes, you, in the back," she chirped, her smile bright. "I have a question," I said, my voice clear and calm. "What would you do if a family heirloom, something precious and irreplaceable, clashed with your new decor? How would you handle that?" The smile on Brenda's face froze. Her eyes went wide. Her gaze darted around the room, searching for the face behind the question. When they met mine, the color drained from her cheeks. She looked like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming garbage truck. Well, she stammered. "Or," I continued, my tone light and conversational, "do you think it's more important to just declutter it? Send it to the compost heap?" A nervous murmur rippled through the audience. The old ladies were starting to look at her with suspicion. "I'll take that as a no comment," I said, smiling sweetly. "That's very zen of you." I turned and walked out of the bookstore, my heart light. The ghost of my mother, I was certain, was laughing. I could almost smell her rosewater perfume mingling with the scent of new books. Back in my apartment, I went to the small fire escape and looked at the big, beautiful rosemary bush I had potted there. It was flourishing, a testament to the strange, hilarious, and deeply satisfying arc of justice. My mother was safe. She was growing. And she was the most fragrant, aggressively healthy rosemary bush in the entire state. I ran my fingers over its leaves, inhaling the scent. The familiar piney aroma filled my nostrils, and for a moment, I could almost hear my mother's voice. "Well, Mom," I whispered to the plant, a huge grin spreading across my face. "You were definitely not a downer. You are the best thing that ever happened to that compost heap." The bush seemed to rustle in the breeze, and for just a moment, I could swear I saw a single, perfect, dewdrop of water on one of its leaves, like a tiny tear of joy. A few weeks later, I heard that Brenda's book had been pulled from the shelves. The local news had done a story on the controversy, and her publisher had decided to cut their losses. The influencer career she'd tried to build was in shambles. Her TikTok account, once so carefully curated, was now a ghost town. And my father? He filed for divorce. He told me he'd finally seen the light, finally understood that Brenda was a force of chaos, not order. He was planning a solo trip to Italy, to rediscover himself and find some peace. Maybe I'll bring back some rosemary, he joked. I laughed. I think we have enough here. The rosemary bush continued to thrive. I used it in everything. I made rosemary-infused honey, rosemary-scented candles, rosemary wreaths for the holidays. I became known among my friends as the Rosemary Girl, and I wore the title with pride. One evening, I was sitting on the fire escape, talking to the bush, when I heard a knock on my door. It was my father. I brought wine, he said, holding up a bottle. And I thought we could talk. We sat on the fire escape, looking at the bush, sipping our wine. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I want you to know something, my father said, his voice quiet. Your mother would have been proud of you. Not just for what you did, though I have to admit, it was brilliant, but for how you handled it. With dignity. With humor. With grace. I smiled. I learned from the best. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the rosemary bush sway in the breeze. Dad, I said finally, I want to plant another rosemary bush. In the backyard. Where Brenda planted her herb garden. I want to turn that whole section into a memorial garden. For Mom. He nodded, tears in his eyes. I think that's a wonderful idea. And that's what we did. We turned the backyard into a beautiful, fragrant memorial garden, with the original rosemary bush as the centerpiece. We planted lavender and sage and thyme, all the herbs my mother had loved. We put in a bench, so we could sit and remember her. And every spring, when the rosemary bloomed, I would think about the strange, winding journey that had brought us here. The anger and the grief and the desire for justice. The compost heap and the mugshot and the viral fame. The court case and the community service and the book reading. And I'd think about Brenda, somewhere out there, probably still trying to find her inner goddess or balance her chakras. I didn't hate her anymore. I didn't even really feel angry. I just felt grateful. Grateful for the lesson she'd taught me about standing up for myself. Grateful for the way the whole thing had brought me and my father closer. Grateful for the rosemary bush that had grown from the ashes of my mother's memory. Karma, I learned, is real. And sometimes, it smells faintly of rosemary. So there you have it. The story of how I got my stepmother arrested for throwing away my mother's ashes. It wasn't the path I expected to take, and it certainly wasn't the path anyone else would have recommended. But it was the path I needed to take. Sometimes, justice isn't about sending someone to prison. Sometimes, it's about making them breathe in the smell of rotting vegetables every day for 300 hours. Sometimes, it's about planting a rosemary bush in the soil that held your mother's remains. Sometimes, it's about finding peace in the most unexpected places. I still have that rosemary bush. It's thriving, just like my mother would have wanted. And every time I cook with it, I think of her. I think of her laughter, her warmth, her gentle presence. I think of the way she would have handled this whole situation, with grace, with humor, and with a quiet determination to do what was right. Brenda is a distant memory now, a cautionary tale I tell at parties. My father has moved on, and we've rebuilt our relationship. The house has been redecorated again, this time with colors that don't make me want to cry. And the rosemary bush? It just keeps growing. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the power of love, and to the fact that sometimes, the best revenge is a very healthy herb plant. Have you ever had a family member cross a line? What would you have done if someone threw away your loved one's ashes? Drop your craziest family drama stories in the comments. I read every single one, and trust me, some of them are wild. Send it to someone who needs a good laugh, someone who's dealing with a difficult family situation, or honestly, just someone who appreciates a good revenge story. The more people who know about Brenda's compost heap adventure, the better. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a video. I've got more stories coming, some hilarious, some heartwarming, and yes, some involving more family drama.